Hello and welcome to our second webinar this evening on April 1st at 7 p.m. with a member of our cohort 7 in the New Jersey Educational Technology Leadership Program at NJCU. I am Samantha Bonner and I'm here with Phillip Crisostomo, and we are going to be presenting his session in Leading in a Pandemic tonight this evening. If you're going to be watching us asynchronously, please feel free to reach out to Phillip with any questions that you have, as I'm sure he's more than happy to answer any questions that you have in regards to his presentation this evening. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Phillip so he can begin his presentation for us this evening.
Thank you very much. So glad that I could be here tonight to present. I think, especially now that we are at the 1-year anniversary of the impact of COVID, going back and reflecting on what that year has been like in education is kind of startling. I think when I think about how much has changed in the past year or so in regards to technology, teacher pedagogy, working with students in different types of settings, remotely, hybrid, there's been so much change going on. Teachers have learned so much, and they also have been very stressed out too because of all the changes happening. And so, reflecting on just what that past year looks like, now we need to start thinking about, well, what does leadership look like going forward? So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the experiences we've had in Willingboro in terms of how the pandemic impacted education with us, why we're leaning now towards the use of innovation and ed tech to be able to change some of the practices that we've had from the past, as well as trying to make our education more engaging than ever before. A lot of our lessons we learned from the pandemic itself, but we also had some things fall in place. So I'm going to talk about that as we go along, and then we'll also get into some of the lessons that we've learned from that, and I'd like to be able to share those lessons with you as you look at how you can be able to lead within your district. So just first, a little bit about me. My name is Phillip Crisostomo. I've been in education now for 20 years. This is my 9th year as an administrator. It's really strange to think that it's been that long that I've been working in schools. My current position is the Supervisor of Instructional Technology and Data Analysis, which is kind of a handful. And the position is as well, but I really do enjoy what I do, getting to work with ed tech, with our technology department, with our teachers, our students, trying to make sure everybody knows how things work. And also, I'm currently a doctoral student at NJCU in the Educational Technology Leadership Program. I'm a member of cohort 7, so we have 1 more year until we finish our education there. Grateful for the time that we've spent studying there. If you have any questions, feel free to always, to throw them out. Also provide my email at the end if you'd like to connect with me personally at some point, especially if you're joining in asynchronously. So first, I want to throw this quote out, something to think about in terms of innovation. We create a culture of innovation in the schools, except that there will be many successes and some failures, but those failures will drive even more success. And this is from Ryan Embroil, who's a high school principal. And I think often as leaders, we're very afraid of failure, regardless of what type of leader we are. We're always afraid that something will go wrong. We're going to get blamed for it. And, things are going to go into tubes. And what we have to realize is failure is going to happen. Not that we want to expect it, not that we just want to brush that off, but we want to use those failures to drive us to become even more successful. So first, let me tell you a little bit about Willingboro Public Schools. We're a school district located in South Jersey, 3,400 students. 97.1% of our population are minority, with 81.5% that are Black. And so we have, we've always traditionally been a minority school district. We have the majority of our students that are free reduced lunch, and our district factor group is DE, for those of you in New Jersey that are familiar. So we have a large number of students that are also below the poverty line, some that are homeless. I didn't list it, but we're starting to see rising numbers of students that are English language learners coming from other countries, and almost 20% of our students with disabilities. Now, these don't necessarily have to be things that hold us back. These can be things that actually propel us forward and allow us to do great things. Whether we're a small school district or a large school district, that what makes us up doesn't necessarily have to define who we are. But just in terms of thinking about the technology in the past, a lot of our technology purchases before the pandemic, they focused on great ideas and not best practices. Secondly, there was a lot of sporadic training on programs, on how things worked. There's a lack of vision and implementation planning. Our curriculum focused on teaching programs, but not critical thinking. So we showed students how to use programs. We relied on the programs to kind of do some of the work, but we're not teaching those critical thinking skills. We found every school was an island when it came to technology implementation. One school would do one thing, one school would do another. And in some cases, that might not be a bad thing because you're trying to meet the needs of the students in your school, but in others, it helped to prevent that cohesiveness between schools within the district. And overall, we dealt with a lot of frustration and low morale when it came to implementing technology. We found that anytime we tried to implement something new, there was always that dejection. Why do we have to do something new? We're going to be just changing this up and using a different program another year later. There's no sense in trying to use these programs. And so you find a lot of staff members that just be frustrated with technology implementation. And to be honest, I can't say I blame them because that was the case. You had schools doing different things. You had that lack of support and the lack of ability to know how to support. And when we found technology was constantly changing, it was hard to keep up with what was going on. So, you know, pre-pandemic, there's just a lot of frustration in regards to technology. And
Excuse me, Phil.
using newer technology, but they're using previous types of methods. And so they're not changing the way that they engage with students. They're not changing the way that they teach. A lot of their pedagogy was rooted in past practice, not necessarily best practice. Now, of course, why did this change? And the answer really, the biggest part of the answer was really COVID. And had it not been for COVID, it might have been tougher to see some of the implementation that of technology that we had within the past year. Not to say that it wouldn't have happened, but COVID forced all of us to be able to think differently about technology. Now, instead of having it there to use, we had to rely on technology. We had to be able to use computers to be able to see our students. We had to use them to complete our work. We had to use them to study, to research. There was no way around that. And in our situation, we've been remote actually since March 13th. In Willingboro, we're getting ready to go back on April 19th. So it'll be over a year since our students have been in the classroom. We've been forced to work remotely, which meant we were forced to have to learn technology just to be able to teach our students. Now, I will say, with the development of COVID and the pandemic, some pieces just fell into place. We were very fortunate with this because before the pandemic started, we actually had a technology leadership team in place at our high school. And that team was working to support teachers, to provide some coaching, to provide some informal professional development to help us move closer towards being comfortable with using tech in our classrooms. And as we saw the writing on the wall, we asked for that opportunity to plan what remote instruction could look like for the high school. We were glad that our leadership was able to support us in that endeavor. And next thing you know, we had the time to create the plan for us before we went out on March 13th. And that plan ended up being able to be used across the district. And we shared that plan with multiple schools around the country. After we went out on remote learning, we had a new superintendent come to the district. And then, of course, anytime you have a new superintendent, you have change. The superintendent wants to focus on being able to better utilize the technology that we have. And even as always, there's always some restructuring that goes along. But in this case, there was additional content supervisors and my position as a supervisor of instructional technology. So that restructuring allowed for additional support in place for teachers as we went into the 2020-21 school year. Now, some other pieces that fell into place, we were very fortunate with additional funding. We had some additional Title I funding, as well as CARES Act and Digital Divide funds. We were able to use this to purchase enough Chromebook devices so students have one at home, and when they return to school, we'll have one at school as well. So that way, we don't have to worry about students taking them back and forth. We don't have to worry about whether students have a device at home that they can use. They already have one that they can use at home, and we have brand new devices in school for when they return. So that way we can meet the needs of the learners wherever they're at. We were able to provide hotspots for those families that needed that didn't have internet access. And we also were able to provide Promethean boards, touchscreen interactive boards for every single classroom in the district so that they could, our teachers, when we come back to synchronous instruction, synchronous hybrid instruction in a few weeks, they're going to be able to better interact, engage with students that are both at home and at school. So we were able to purchase that for all the classrooms in the district that didn't currently have one, which is, I think, approximately half, maybe 60% of our classes. Very fortunate that this funding was there because it allowed us to utilize the funds that we had to take care of those glaring needs, fill those holes, and then now be able to start thinking, having more forward thinking in terms of what we would like to be able to do in the future. So other pieces, though, took some careful planning. And while we were very fortunate that some things just kind of fell together, there was a lot of work going on behind the scenes. We had some trust in our administration. They allowed the high school technology team to craft this remote learning plan. They didn't have the pride of saying, well, it wasn't my plan, so we're not going to use it. They took a look at it. We worked on some of the issues that they had to try to make sure this would work for our high school team. And then we actually were able to translate that to the whole district. We had trust in teachers being able to provide training and professional development. We spent a lot of time in the beginning of remote learning, doing a lot of training on the platforms that teachers really hadn't focused on using. We had a lot of teachers that had not ever used Google Classroom before. We had teachers that did not know how to use a digital whiteboard. We had teachers that were struggling just to make sure that they could be able to use some of the Google features that we have as a Google district, like Google Apps, Google Docs, Google Calendar. And so, there was this divide, with some of our staff, and we had to bring them back up to speed so that they could be able to focus on teaching and not the technology. So there's a lot of training that was involved. We had to talk about technology pedagogy instead of just the programs. How do we use them to improve our teaching? How do we change our teaching? What does teaching look like in a remote setting or a hybrid setting? There's a lot of vision and implementation planning and a lot of flexibility. And we can't tell you how many times that something we planned had to be changed just to make something work. We planned a certain number of Chromebooks in every building. We had to change how we distributed them. We had to change how we implemented certain programs, who we allowed access to. Things are always had to be flexible in the past year with everything going on, all the change that was happening, all the things that we were learning. And so we had to be able to be flexible with the times and the new guidance that came down from the state. And so we always were looking at how we can do something different, how we can do something new, and not how we can not allowing our setbacks, our failures, our frustrations to limit us. We did some consulting with other schools and districts. We looked to see, what are they doing? How do they make this work? And we also were trying to find research on best practices and new ideas, because a lot of what districts were trying to do, most districts haven't done before. There was not a lot of remote teaching. There wasn't a lot of hybrid teaching. And so there's growing research, but there's still not a lot of research yet about the effectiveness of it, and how you can be able to improve that practice and make sure that students were engaged. So, we were trying to do research and finding, the best information we could share with our staff. Now, all of that being said, while we didn't actually focus on these two particular leadership models, these two leadership models I'm going to talk about next really did play a role into the success of our transition through the pandemic. The first being servant leadership. And, we had in previous years, and I'm sure this can be your experience in other places, you can try to, you might see a lot of leaders that are just focused on being the boss. And instead of trying to figure out how do we make things work. So, servant leaders are always looking for ways that they can be able to improve what's going on. They're not relegating themselves to be the top of the chain. They are always trying to work with people and sometimes working for people to make sure that those people could do their job. So a lot of times, as a servant leader, for instance, I would try to make sure that that the frustrations and the issues that people had could be stemmed or could be minimized so that they could focus on their work and educating our students and not the problems that we faced. And that servant leadership culture kind of prevailed throughout a lot of the district. We had a lot of people rolling their sleeves up and getting involved with Chromebook distributions, material distributions, contacting parents, coordinating events. And so we actually were able to create a more positive culture. We were able to build trust and motivate staff in ways that we just weren't able to do before. And like I said before, with that frustration we continually had with implementing technology, just being able to build that culture where people will say, I'm willing to try something new because people have faith that I can do it, because people will understand that this is new, because people will understand that I'm going to fail as long as I pick myself back up. And ultimately, we kind of followed that motto that Robert Greenleaf stated: the servant leader is servant first. Our goal again was not to be the boss, the main leader. The goal was to make sure that everybody that was on the front lines working with our students remotely had everything that they could have, the training, the programming, the programs, the platforms, the materials, anything that they needed to effectively do their job and not have to worry about other factors impeding education. More importantly, we focused on, we implemented a lot of team leadership in order to make this work, because again, it wasn't about the boss making all the decisions and making everything happen. There was a lot of trust among the staff to be able to make this work. We had to build a lot of capacity among our staff, and building trust among our staff, and the team leadership approach saw us build the capacity as leaders, or as teachers, to be leaders, so that it wasn't just leadership itself doing the work, pulling the weight, but also being able to say that those staff members were worthy enough to be able to lead alongside of us. Now, speaking of which, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, we had these teacher leadership teams that organically grew out of the pandemic. They started before the pandemic. We're very fortunate we actually had a teacher leader within the high school building that came up with the idea of a education focused team that would work on coaching, providing modeling, providing support for those teachers that were just struggling with being able to use technology. So people had a go-to. People knew they could feel comfortable with somebody. And that organically grew into this these teams across the district where people were able to support each other. And we could also bring those teams back together to talk about common issues, common concerns, and try to proactively deal with some of them. We call them the synchronous learning support team because once we moved into the next phase of the pandemic, when we started to reopen schools in September, we were still remote. And in fact, Willingboro was one of the first districts to go remote or to start the year remote and announce those intentions. With our superintendent also being at a press conference to talk about our reasons for staying remote and how we were going to make instruction work. So these synchronous learning support teams were expanded across the district to be able to support that. We gave them training. We provided multiple sessions of PD, provided some coaching and mentoring on new platforms and programs. And that also allowed them to be a bridge between teachers and district leadership, because sometimes we can be, as leaders, removed from the boots on the ground, from the teachers that are in the classrooms, and we may not necessarily understand why they're experiencing some of the issues that they are. And so sometimes they were able to voice those concerns better than the teachers were. Sometimes they were able to share those issues with each other and be able to come up with ideas. And in fact, just recently we had that happen. Somebody asked a question I didn't know the answer to, and somebody else was able to jump in and say, hey, I know the answer, let me help you out with that. And that comfortability to be able to do that and be willing to share among staff was built as a result of these teams being here. They provided training on a lot of different platforms, but they also started working on teaching teachers how to teach with technology. And it's not just about knowing how the platform works, but knowing how to integrate these platforms into our lessons to make lessons engaging. Now, why did this work? First of all, because it was teacher-led, we had teachers that were comfortable learning from each other. And I know that as administrators, we try to build that culture where teachers are willing to trust our leadership and be comfortable learning from us. But that's always difficult, especially when you feel vulnerable. And in a situation that was brand new, where teachers were not was able to work so well. This team leadership approach, I taught leadership skills, shared expectations, and frameworks. It wasn't just about telling our teams, this is what you're going to do, go do it. We had to talk about how you do some of these. How do you work with a teacher? How do you coach somebody that gets frustrated? How do you work through some of the frustrations that they have? Who can you go to for assistance other than, coming to the same people all the time? So we tried to provide that support, but we also didn't micromanage. It wasn't my team. I didn't do all the work. I trusted those teams to do the work within those buildings. And so that, again, we were building a culture of trust. We were building a culture of capacity where teachers were able to start leading on their own with the comfort of knowing that they had the support of their administrative team. We also stressed that leadership was more than a position. So these SLS team members, where they work with administrators and non-instructional staff, as well as with teachers and parents. So, we had administrators going to these teachers and saying, hey, I need help with Google. I need help with Google Calendar, or I need help with Bitmoji Classroom or Bitmoji Office. I need help with these types of things. And knowing that we were not guided by leadership positions, we were guided by leadership as a practice. And so we were comfortable with asking other people. There were plenty of times where I would ask other teachers because my experiences are different than theirs. So they can provide better input than I can, even though I might be the ed tech leader in the district. And just to kind of see that approach, you have myself leading these teams. These teams are leading teachers and administrators. Sometimes I'm providing for the teams. Sometimes I'm giving them the resources. Sometimes they're sharing, what the teachers and administrators are seeing and hearing and experiencing. There were times that they would come back to me with problems or recommendations for additional programs to buy that would support remote learning. So we continually were working together to make a lot of these things happen. It wasn't me doing all of this work, and because there's only one of me. Now, why else did this work? There was a value in learning. Everybody knew they had to be comfortable with technology. We were put in this situation with the pandemic where we were forced to have to use technology to teach. We had no other choice. The team, by the way, and I mentioned this before, they didn't just turnkey technology. They provided support. They provided coaching. In some cases, they were modeling how to use some of these programs and how to be able to teach with technology. We promoted them as leaders throughout the district. So in some of our PD sessions, we gave them shout outs, some compliments and praise. Our teachers did the same and were, thanking and sharing with them. Now also, I want to specify why these teams are so important. So they again, I said this before, that these teams could not only share their issues, they could share solutions. So they could sometimes work through and create those solutions together if they didn't have them before. The work was, and the work still is, great. This time of remote learning really has been difficult for a lot of people. And we really can't do it all. Leaders couldn't provide training, support, and coaching on their own. No one could be a savior here. We all had to chip in and do the work to make this happen. And we built a shared culture. So again, as people felt more comfortable with technology, they were more likely to seek other training. They were more likely to change their practices. They were more likely to try and fail, knowing that we weren't just looking at every failure. We were looking at how people were going to move on from those failures. Now, how do you drive innovation within your school? Here's a hint. You can't do it alone. Again, you cannot be the savior here. You cannot come in with the grand plans and the grand schemes and everybody just follows along with it. You really do have to build this capacity to lead. So if you're the administrator, you have to create goals. If you're going to work with teams, you have to create goals and how you're going to build capacity. Identify the team that's going to work with you. If you have a team like this teacher technology team that we had, you want to identify how are you going to compensate them. release time, extra pay, or a stipend. Maybe those incentives are not monetary, but you want to find out how you can be able to thank them for the work that they've done, defining the roles and expectations, because you do have to set the boundaries for how things work. You don't want people to overreach. You want people to understand where the limitations are, what they can do, what they can't do. Do you let them make decisions? Do you have them come to you for decisions? You want to set the tone for how things are going to work. You must provide training too on technology, on pedagogy, and coaching and leadership. Because again, you have to build capacity within your buildings in order for people to create this culture where they're going to trust you, where they're going to trust each other. And that just doesn't happen when you're just teaching about the programs. You have to teach people how to teach each other. And eventually you want to be at the point where you're building this culture where every teacher can teach each other. And most importantly, manage, but don't micromanage. If you are micromanaging everything, if you have to be in control or in charge, you're going to find yourself frustrated because you're going to be doing all of the work and your teams won't be doing anything. And you want to be able to distribute the leadership and distribute the work among everybody so that you're all, again, doing this together. That's what really makes this model work so well. Now, on the flip side, if you're the teacher, first of all, you've got to know your administration. Some administrators would be very gung-ho towards creating a team within their building that would be able to help coach and provide support to other teachers, especially as we're continuing to learn and use new technologies. Identify how these teacher teams will benefit your organization, because you're going to have to pitch this idea. You might not be able to grow this organically. You've got to pitch it, you've got to sell it. You have to make sure that you have your administration on board. And again, you have to define how you're going to compensate participants and leaders. You may not have the ability to do that monetarily. You may have to do that in other ways. And again, you've got to manage, not micromanage, because your teams need to know that you trust them to do the work. So I just want to speak very quickly to it. And if you're a teacher that's listening to this today, what I want to encourage you to think about is that your leaders can't do this alone. They really do need support in making change happen. And knowing that they have your support and your willingness to roll up your sleeves and be a servant leader and part of a team certainly will benefit them greatly. Of course, every administration is different. Some people may look at things different ways, but I know the majority of administrators really would benefit and would appreciate your willingness to be able to step up as a leader. And I will say that in a lot of schools, there seems to be this dearth of leadership among teachers. Teachers are not always willing to innovate, to try new things, to be ready to fail. Because we're always afraid of that evaluation. What happens if the principal comes in and sees me, it just doesn't go right? You want things to go well enough that your failures don't get noticed. But again, sometimes you do have to step out in faith and know that you're going to try to aim for great success. And you can't aim for great success if you rest in mediocrity. And speaking of not being afraid of failure, again, remember, some things don't work out. You have to work through your failures, then learn from them. And so regardless of whether you're a teacher or you're a leader, and especially if you're a leader that's struggling with building that capacity, and I'll say, I experienced it myself. I found that one of the things that I struggled the most as a leader was building capacity and trust among teachers to be able to lead. How do they know how to lead if I don't tell them, if I don't teach them how to lead? I expected people knew how to lead on their own, that it was kind of this innate sense. And really, people needed to learn how to lead and what was expected from them. And so now that I've learned from those lessons, I'm going to do that much better. And most importantly, you got to keep your eye on the prize. So no matter what you do, when you're trying to innovate, when you're trying new things, you have to remember what the goal is in mind so that you can always work to that goal. Because if you keep your eye on the prize, you're not going to notice so much when you stumble. So at this point, if we have anybody with us, I'd love to be able to answer any questions that you have. If not, I'll throw my email to Sam, and she can also be able to share that out. You can also find me at phillipcrisostomo.com, so you can find my contact information that way. I'd love to be able to connect with you and answer any questions that you have in terms of building capacity and driving innovation within your building.
That was excellent, Phil. And, for questions that I would have for you as a participant in watching your section on leading in a pandemic. You mentioned a lot about servant leadership, but what about teachers or administrators that might maintain a different leadership style? How could you make this work?
And it's a great question, Sam. I think sometimes, we have to make sure that we're not limiting ourselves to just what we see in front of us. Again, it comes down to the vision of what do we ultimately want to be able to see, and then how do we get there? And sometimes that path isn't necessarily straight. Sometimes that path is pretty crooked. You have to try things. You realize that they don't work. You go a different direction. If you're that leader and you're trying to build that within your building, and you don't have that culture there, you're going to have to work to enforce and teach that culture. You may need to change things that encourage some type of culture, or type of culture that allows people to be willing to trust. I think in some cases, especially for some schools and some environments, you have to build a trust that isn't there. And it's really hard to innovate if you don't have that culture of trust and that willingness to be innovative. You have to cultivate that first, at least a little bit, before you can jump in and try some of these other things that we're talking about today. And ultimately, as an administrator, sometimes you have to make sure you step out so that people see you as a servant and not necessarily as a leader. And so that means, going out and stepping out of your comfort zone to do some of the things that they wouldn't expect you to do. If that means, fixing a computer, if that means, sweeping up the glass that fell so that the teacher can go on with their lesson, if that means that you are trying to make copies so that the teacher doesn't have to worry about that, they can focus on paying back attention to their class. You're taking that time to do those things that people can see that you're willing to be a team player, that you're willing to take care of some of the things that allow them just to go back to focusing on what's most important, which is educating students. But as far as the teachers go, I know it's tough when you don't have that culture within. And again, you have to build that culture a little differently if you're a teacher, but you can still build that. You can show that by example. People can see you as a leader, even if your leadership doesn't. And sometimes you can still be able to work within that framework.
Wow, that's really good advice, Phil. And one other question that I have for you, is there any specific strategies or icebreakers or things that could be said or used for teachers as teacher leaders that are trying to work with maybe hesitant members of staff or the other faculty, that they're trying to help them and get them to innovate? But are there any specific strategies that you have found in your professional experience with over 2 decades of being in a school building in K-12? Could you provide any things that you might find have been helpful in your experience and helping to nudge somebody along, so to speak?
Sometimes it's best to start from what they realize they do need. And you can work from that angle. So a teacher that says, I really don't see why this particular program is important to use. Maybe you want to talk about pedagogy first. What does your teaching look like? And eventually then you can branch into why such and such a program or such an idea might be beneficial. So it's fine. Sometimes it's finding a different angle, and knowing how can I connect with that person. And in fact, I was actually, and this is a little off topic, but hopefully I'll make the connection here. I met today with a parent and another leader within the district and a teacher because of some concerns that were happening. And ultimately, everybody had to find some common ground. Everybody had to find some type of connection there. And that connection just came in off of a random comment that somebody made. But once we found that connection, everybody just got more comfortable with each other. The tension started to lower. And we felt like we could be able to then talk with each other and be more free about what we were saying, as opposed to that anxiousness, that anxiety from that conversation that can sometimes happen. So, finding the connections to, what people like, what people know, why something is important. Once you make a connection with somebody, then you can work off that connection. And if you don't have that connection there, it makes it really hard to, convince somebody to want to do something. So again, finding the right angle to connect with somebody that you can eventually maybe show them why that change is important.
That's awesome, Phil, because it sounds a lot of like what teachers do every day, right? Trying to find the why and make the connections for their students. So, I think it's a matter of perspective, like you said, and finding that mirror for educators to realize that leaders are doing the same thing. And one of the last questions that I had that came to my mind was, what was one of the biggest successes that you could say you've had with COVID this year, despite the difficulties and the challenges that have faced leaders? What is something that you could say that you have happily taken away as maybe a triumphant takeaway from learning from this and what you've gleaned in the pandemic as a leader?
So we recently did a survey, and as I mentioned before, we've been all remote since March 31st. And the district did a survey to find out, where how parents felt about remote learning, how things were going. Eventually what they wanted to see in terms of, whether they wanted their child to return when we come back in April. And, ultimately the majority of parents were actually very satisfied with what we were doing. And, knowing from past years and seeing the frustration of parents with some things that were happening, and back and forth between, the district and parents, and to have the majority of our parents say that they're happy with the instruction that we're providing when we're doing something completely brand new. For our teachers to actually, I had a teacher that emailed me and said, I went to a conference, I'm hearing everybody talk about all their technology problems. And I said, I'm so thankful that we don't have them. I think just knowing that people are happy with what we are able to provide and what we are able to do, even knowing the circumstances that we are in. I take a lot of pride in that, and I know our district does, and our teachers, we mentioned that to them actually yesterday in the PD. Like we should take pride in the work that we've done, because a lot of our parents are not just okay with, but they're happy with our instruction, and the frustrations that they have aren't necessarily about teachers. It's not about their teaching styles or how they're not connecting with kids during remote learning, but about some of the technology issues that are just kind of normal with technology or with remote learning right now. So I think we're very pleased with knowing that we've been able to make this process as smooth as possible, that our community sees it, that our teachers see it, and that we can hang our hat on all the work that we've done and feel proud of it.
That's awesome, Phil. I mean, because again, best practice is best practice. And it sounds like you have that same thing that teachers always tell their students, same thing a leader does with their staff, right? To be proud of the hard work that you've put in, because ultimately that's the best that you've done. And no matter what, despite the challenges, you guys deserve a pat on the back. This is great, Phil. Thank you so much. And again, I'll make sure that I link to your information for participants that want to see this asynchronously. And if they have questions, they can reach out to you and be able to get their questions answered.
And thank you so much for having me be able to present today. I'm glad I could be here.
Absolutely. Thank you.